And count to 3 starting now.
Welcome. I'm Kristen McCollum. I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief Executive Officer for YWCA Central Carolinas. And we are so glad that you are choosing to spend your precious time with us this evening on this important topic. This topic, the criminalization of Black and brown girls, falls squarely at the intersection of the mission of YWCA, eliminating racism, empowering women. And we are so pleased to have you all here, our guests and our panelists. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our wonderful Community Engagement Manager, Jamila Green, to begin the forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I am so excited to be here today. Like Kristen said, my name is Jamila Green, and I am the Community Engagement Manager, and I have the complete honor and duty to create programming that focuses on racial justice. And this is my first one ever, guys. So this is really exciting. But before I get this conversation going, it is very important that I share with you all the amazing panel that we have with us today. And I'm going to read a little bit about them. Have a brief bio, very brief. So I'm going to go ahead and hop into that. So our first person that we do have on our panel is Dr. Susan McCarter, who teaches at UNC Charlotte, where she co-facilitates the UNC Charlotte Racial Equity Skill Building Caucus, leads multiple funded research studies examining the school to prison pipeline, juvenile diversion, and racial equity, and speaks and trains nationally on these topics. So we're grateful to have her here. Our next person that we have on the panel is Ms. Kristen McCollum, who serves as a proud assistant principal at Cary Middle School, and she's been there since 2018. In addition to her role as an assistant principal, she serves as a founding member of the hashtag, I gotta do the hashtag part, Equity for Wake organization, a grassroots group of educators who plan equity-centered programming for North Carolina educators. So glad to have her here as well, yes. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Pam Yuen, who is the Director of Government Relations at YWCA USA, where she focuses on national policies relevant to YWCA's mission to eliminate racism and empower women. She has almost a decade of government relations and advocacy experience and regularly, excuse me, y'all, I cannot talk today, regularly liaisons with Capitol Hill on a diverse range of issues. So let's get a virtual round of applause going for our amazing panel. I'm so happy that you guys have given your time to us to really talk about a topic that is near and dear to not only my heart, but so many of you all on the panel's heart. And so to get started, my first question is, as researchers, educators, and advocates, how does this topic relate to the work that you do currently? And we can just go around.
If I go around, does that mean you want me to start?
Sure, it's such a weird round. My round is different from y'all's round. So we'll start with Susan, and then we'll go to Kristen and round it out with Pam.
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. And thank you to the YMCA for raising awareness on this important topic. I'd like to acknowledge that the land I'm on is the land of the Catawba and the Sugaree people. I also want to begin by acknowledging that I'm a white person and that I bring a lifetime of bias to any conversation on race and racism. But I also bring a belief that white people need to learn more, we need to do better, and we need to follow the lead of our colleagues of color in order to foster racial equity. So thank you so much for inviting me and my whiteness to this conversation. The topic relates to my research, to my organizing, to my practice change around the school to prison pipeline, as well as intersects with my work for Race Matters for Juvenile Justice and our Charlotte Racial Justice Consortium. It's also personal to me. As a person of faith, I subscribe to an abundance model, and I recognize that my liberation is connected to Jamila's, and I can't be free. No one can be free until we're all free. So again, thank you for this important discussion. I look forward to this hour together. Kristen.
Yeah, so also echo the same comments. I'm so grateful and thankful to be here today. This conversation is one that is ongoing, right? And we're not going to solve all systemic racism in this hour, but I am confident that we are going to make some clear steps forward. As a school administrator, the reality is I have the choice each day to be a disruptor or someone who upholds a system that is perpetuating this stark injustice for our girls of color within our educational system. The reality is that each day when kids come into buildings, they see school administrators like me, they see educators, teachers, school staff throughout the day who are responsible for their care and make some really critical decisions about their life in the moment and long term. And so I think my role to the work is how do I change my own perspective and the things that I do each day, but also how do I influence others, other educators, right, in my group Equity for Wake, throughout our district, throughout the state of North Carolina, and within my locus of control to have impacts on our students and particularly those who are marginalized.
I think I'm here to round out the circle. So good evening, everyone. As Jamila had mentioned, my name is Pam Yuen. I am the Director of Government Relations at YWCA USA. So I am really glad to be here with our sisters at YWCA Central Carolina, and a big shout out to all of our YWCA sisters across North Carolina today. And it is really a pleasure that you're able to bring in the national organization where I sit here just a couple blocks from our nation's capital, and to bring a unique perspective on how I think this conversation is really playing out inside our wonky beltway, as we always say. I also come to this conversation, as Jamila had mentioned, as a decade, and I hope I haven't dated myself here, but with a decade of advocacy experience, but also from a unique perspective as an AAPI woman who, often comes to this conversation with a unique perspective on education policy. It is a near and dear issue to my heart, and an issue that I think we can continue to make large strides and need to make large strides on, particularly in the equity space. So by way of background, though, YWCA for over 160 years really has been dedicated to this mission of empowering women and, most importantly, eliminating racism for all is one of the key words in our mission statement. And following the racial reckoning that really heightened, I think, in the summer of 2020. It was a unique opportunity that we saw here at YWCA USA and with our sister organizations across the country to uniquely interject, once again, our mission into this conversation and reinforce this notion of not only eliminating racism, but uniquely eliminating racism for all. And so that's why I think I'm excited to be able to have this opportunity to really speak a little bit to our report that we released over the summer that year. We still deserve safety is the key word that we interjected into the conversation. How unfortunately that highly gendered narrative when it comes to the role of police against people of color really rose to the top at that time, and the disproportionate effects that we are seeing not only in the field, in practice, but also the need for increased education and awareness and policy making here on Capitol Hill to be able to robustly and wholeheartedly continue to address this issue. And like Kristen had said, this is not an issue that I think we are going to address overnight, but look forward to, I think, continuing to have robust conversations and continue to move the needle down the road with all of you today. So it's really a pleasure to be with all of you.
Thank you so much, Pam, Susan, and Kristen, again, for being here. I think that it is definitely time to have this conversation, a conversation that's not often had, it's oftentimes overlooked. And one thing that I had to do to become well versed in this issue was actually read up on a lot of the statistics and the information that people do not know about. And I talked to several other folks about this, and they were like, really? Are you sure? Seriously? But so many times our girls of color are oftentimes like, swept up under the rug. Other groups that do indeed need the same type of attention normally get more attention than our girls of color. So I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation right now. And I'm going to read you guys a couple of statistics so that the audience can get an idea of why this conversation is so important. Latinx girls are 1.6 times more likely to be suspended than white women, or white girls, excuse me. And all of these statistics are based on the National Women's Law Center. So you guys can check that out, look that up. There's tons more information. But Native girls, our Indigenous sisters, little sisters, are 2 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. And as we get closer and we continue to hear more statistics, it gets worse. So you have Black girls that make up 8% of the student enrollment population across the country, yet 14% of out of school suspensions and 47% of suspensions among female students in general. So these numbers are not making any sense. So I want to ask my panel, what perspective do you get when you hear statistics like that? And do you believe that there is something else going on that maybe we aren't seeing? Like, what are your perspectives on those numbers? And we can go around, or if you just are like, I got something to say, you say what you got to say.
Sure, I'll jump in and start this round. I think there's so many things that we see in like girlhood that are also reflected in womanhood. And so I think about, especially in school settings, like how our girls of color are perceived and seen. Right, there's this adultification where they are seen as older. So right, a 12-year-old Black girl is on average probably going to be perceived as 15 to 16 years old. Right, and like this trope about being too grown, or I think a stereotype that I often go back to is like this idea of an angry Black woman, when really you're just speaking passionately and directly, but there's this idea that there is something else behind that. And I see that same stereotype with our girls. Right, a little Black girl in her classroom questioning a teacher is not seen as advocating for herself or like trying to push the envelope for her own learning. It is seen as disrespect, right? And so there's so much perception behind adults, and then they perpetuate that onto our girls. And the consequences are startling, right? Like we're talking about suspension, but there's so many exclusionary practices, out of school suspension, in school suspension, simply sitting girls of color outside of the classroom, they're missing learning time and it's having tremendous impacts. And so I think these same stereotypes and tropes that we deal with in womanhood are being perpetuated with our girls and having lasting impacts.
And Kristen, I'd love to be able to kind of piggyback off of that, because not only are the penalties that many of our girls of color are facing, but they are disproportionately, or maybe, let's be blunt about it, sometimes even more harsh on girls of color when their white counterparts have committed the same, I will be blunt with this, offense, and are often disproportionately penalized for the same action. So I wanted to be able to name that specifically. But, as we talk about these statistics and talk about, these actions, it brings me back to some of the stories that we highlighted in our We Still Deserve Safety report. I think of our Faith Fennedy, who is a 11-year-old student from Louisiana, who school officials sent home from her private school the day before picture day and was told not to return. The reason why was because she had violated the school's policy regarding natural hair by wearing braids, despite the fact that Faith had worn braids at her school for 2 years prior to. And so these types of policies, these types of racist dress codes, these targeting, let's be frank, the role of police in school, which I hope we can talk about a little bit more in the conversation, really has a disproportionate effect on girls, their impact, their learning time in classrooms, And I think it is long overdue for us to be able to continue naming these policies and how they are having impacts on our girls of color in particular, and then what we can do to continue to address them. The beauty of our country is its diversity and the ability to bring, these unique perspectives. And if we don't have these individuals in the classroom to contribute to that robust conversation, I think we are all losing out. And so I think, we are looking forward to having that conversation, addressing those policies and what we can think towards solutions and actions going forward.
So unlike Pam, I've kind of been in this DMC, or disproportionate contact, what we now call RED, which is racial and ethnic disparities in juvenile justice. I've been at it for 2 decades, and like Pam, we both started when we were 5. So we've always focused in DMC and RED on the boys, because the boys mathematically make up the majority of what's going on. And Jamila gave us great statistics to start the conversation. I want to throw a couple more at you. So when we look at the context for boys, proportionate to their makeup in the general population, Black boys are 3 times more likely to face a suspension as white boys are. And that's where the focus has been. When we dig a little bit deeper, using the US Department of Education statistics, which Pam will know, were increasingly hard to access between 2016 and 2020, but that's a whole nother webinar for another day on another topic. And now that we're getting some of those data back, when we look at the disproportionality for Black girls versus white girls, Black girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended for than white girls are. So I want to pause right there, because criminologists will talk to you about differential offending, and they'll talk to you about differential processing. And Jamila asked the question, why is this disproportionality happening? Part of it is offending and part of it is processing. But make no mistake about it, I want to be really clear about this. For the exact same offense, a Black girl faces 3 times more likely to face a school disciplinary action than a similarly situated white girl. So for the same offense, they're 3 times more likely to have school disciplinary action that Kristen mentioned, taking them out of the classroom, depriving them of their learning and their power. So why is this happening? This is happening partly on that individual level, but mostly on a broader systemic level that includes explicit bias. It includes implicit bias, naming those anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and gendered policies and practices.
Yeah, I'm over here trying to take notes and jot stuff down. I got a little excited, y'all, but I'm so glad that you brought that up, because one thing I've been reading about a lot, especially while reading Push Out, is this idea of a structure of dominance. So this idea that a lot of the structures that are currently in place, including the educational system, actually serve as spaces where certain stereotypes and biases are pushed. And sometimes those educators may not know it, those administrators might not know it, but they're actually pushing these types of stereotypes by the way they treat their students. And in this case, the way they treat Black girls, or the way they treat our AAPI girls, or they treat our Indigenous girls, or they treat our Latinx girls. So all of our girls, because they are our girls. I think that's one thing we need to own too. They're our girls. That's all happening in those spaces, and there's a reason why we just got to keep chipping at it, having these conversations about it. But one thing I want to talk about is intersectionality, which was a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And I want to ask you guys, like, what role does the intersection between race and gender play when it comes to the criminalization of Black girls? And we can start with whoever wants to jump on this one too. I love to talk about intersectionality.
All right, I'll kick us off. So I like math. If you haven't gotten that yet, I really like math. And we can actually we can statistically isolate the effects of race and gender in these populations. And when we do that, as I just described in that 6-to-1 comparison, we find that race is actually a more significant predictor than gender for our girls, all of our girls. I also want to pause when we're talking about girls, and I want to just bring into the space that typically schools don't, nor do jails or detention centers or the juvenile justice system. They don't define gender beyond a cisgender male, female binary. So I want to throw in here that our LGBTQ members, our youth who don't identify as cisgender male or female, get lost in this shuffle as well. And we know that they are overrepresented as well in suspensions, expulsions, arrests, and incarcerations. So let's include that, and that's perfect. It's perfect time in a conversation about intersectionality. If you haven't read Kimberly Crenshaw's 2015 report, it's called Black Girls Matter, and it's a beautiful summation of a lot of this conversation. But I would have us think about the predictors that we know increase your likelihood of coming into contact with either a suspension or the juvenile justice system. So if you are Black, if you are Indigenous, if you are Latinx, if you're a member of another racialized group, if you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, if you are differently abled, if you are poor, if you have witnessed violence or been a victim of violence, if you have suffered trauma or abuse, you are more likely to come into contact with the school to prison pipeline and juvenile justice. And then pause and think about if you represent multiple categories that I just listed.
Yes, like all of that. Anybody else would like to respond to that? It's important that we think of all the identities that we don't often see, those invisible identities. So that's all I'm gonna say on that. But does anybody else want to respond to this question about the importance of us considering intersectionality when it comes to the criminalization of girls of color?
I don't think Susan could have said it any better, to be quite honest.
Right?
But what I will maybe take a little bit of a different approach to thinking about it is that the statistics that Susan had provided need to continue to provide additional transparency on the situation. We need to, I'm an advocate, I'm a grassroots advocate through and through. You'll hear me always trying to figure out how to make a call to action. And so if there are any actionable items, we need to ensure that we are not only continuing to collect that data to provide additional transparency, but to Susan's point, disaggregating and cross-tabulating that data by race and gender and different identities, such that we can continue to look at the disparities going forward. I think, the pandemic has put us in a very difficult predicament when it comes to data collection moving forward, particularly in the education space. We are looking at the civil rights data collection going forward, and unfortunately we look at because of the out of school time that many students are going to be facing, not only will there be a learning loss and an inability to collect that data, but a lot of that civil rights data that we rely on to provide transparency and speak to these issues will be lost at the same time during this COVID period. So trying to ensure that we continue to collect that data and disaggregate it and cross-tabulate it appropriately, I think is going to be another mission that we need to hold some of our elected officials and administrators accountable to.
Yeah, and solely to add to what they've already shared, that's been incredible. Thinking about like being in schools, and if there are any educators out there, I'm encouraging us to lean into this idea of intersectionality. because it can be scary sometimes to say Black girls or Latinx girls or white girls, but we have to, right? All girls' experiences are not the same. And the data that we just shared is a prime example of that. Right there, teachers are afraid to make clubs. Like, I want to have a club for Black girls in STEM. That is appropriate, right? Affinity spaces are healing for so many of our souls and like have to take place. And intersectionality is real. And we live, right? My Blackness is what comes to mind first for me personally, right? And then my womanhood. And so leaning into that they make up so many different parts of us, I think is so important.
It truly is. And I'm glad that you spoke on that, Kristen, because somebody actually in the comments when they registered was asking about becoming an upstander in the educational spaces. So how can they become an upstander rather than a bystander when things are happening and they see things? So I think that you probably gave them some peace with your answer, saying that if you want to create safe spaces for Black and brown girls in those educational classrooms or in those club spaces, it's important. It's important for their survival ultimately. And as we like go into those educational spaces, I do want to share just a mini little story about a situation that actually happened in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is not too far from us. And it happens every day. But this case was actually printed in We Still Deserve Safety as well. A wonderful document. If you have the ability to hop online after this panel discussion, please check that out on YWCA USA's website. It's a beautifully crafted document. But in late 2018, a 14-year-old girl in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, was tackled and arrested after leaving her classroom with a pass, because we already know the power of the pass. She had a pass in her hand to go call her parent because she was not feeling well. After she was tackled and arrested. And I went through and actually looked at the body cam footage and listened. And while in that space, that SRO said, "You want to act like a grown-up? I'm going to treat you like a grown-up." I'll say it one more time. "You want to act like a grown-up? I'm going to treat you like one, period." So, we're speaking on adultification, right? In that sense, something that Kristen tapped on early in the conversation. So what are your responses to that? And can you give us some context on, counseling over criminalization? There's certain acts in place related or certain legislation that is being pushed currently to have more counselors and mental health specialists in educational spaces rather than continue to have millions and millions of SROs or police officers in educational spaces. Can y'all speak to that at all for me?
Yeah, I'm happy to hop on that one. I think, after you continue to share a lot of these stories that we saw and re-highlighted in We Still Deserve Safety, it takes you a minute just first to take a deep breath because of how impactful they can be. But, YWCA is on the ground presence in communities where police violence is happening, but also with our valued relationship with local law enforcement and our longstanding commitment to racial justice and gender equity really does provide the YWCA sisterhood with a unique perspective on reforms that are needed to really address the immediate growing crisis of police violence. We see on a regular basis the moral imperative for change that is really demanded in this moment, and the ways in which women of color are criminalized and harmed by laws and policies that are supposed to really be protecting us. But that all aside, and that being said, we are very clear in our position when it comes to the role of police and SROs in schools, and have said that we oppose them particularly and have taken action to not only mobilize and speak out on the removal of any federal funds that go towards schools that will support police in schools as well as SROs. We do believe that it is up to the schools and the states and the school districts themselves on whether the SRO or the police officer will remain. but no federal funds should go towards supporting these individuals in particular. And that's why we have for a long time worked very closely with our senators to support the Counseling Not Criminalization Act, which was just recently introduced in the Senate and the House of Representatives, particularly to call for removing those funds and pushing them towards ensuring that we are getting more counselors, mental health professionals, trauma-informed training, and training for those professionals in schools to ensure that we are not only recognizing, but putting the systems in place to ensure that we are addressing that. And that is where we believe is the best use of our federal funds going forward to ensure that we are appropriately addressing the regular compounding effects that our students of color, particularly in this case, our girls of color, are often trying to speak out, are crying out for. But unfortunately, in our school systems and the way that they have been continuing to develop have perpetualized the system that has unfortunately struggled to address these needs thus far.
Yeah, and just to follow up to what Pam shared, right? Like SROs were created in the 60s as community agents with a stark increase after Columbine, right? To combat, with the intention of combating school shootings. But data shows us that's not what's actually happening. There has been no decrease in school-based violence because of their presence. And like for my educators out there, the reality is SROs, school resource officers, are intended for stopping acts of violence. At my school, we only call the SRO when there are possible acts of violence. And so just like hearing this story, which is not a new one, which is one that unfortunately so many of our marginalized kids have experienced, is like infuriating, number one. And number two, I think the language that the police officer uses is so really clear on how we see girls and women and those of color. So it says, you want to act like you're grown, I'm going to show you. I'm going to treat you as such. Well, like, what does that say about how we treat grown Black women? It should the norm be to be harassed and physically assaulted for nothing. And my worry, my concern is that image, right, that is being created, the mental image that is being created in our girls. Because not only was the child who was being physically harmed in this situation impacted, all of the other girls of color watching this occur will forever be changed and internalize that they are less than, or that they deserve this, or to be prepared that this is how society is going to treat them. And so there's so many things to dispel, right? Like there are systems in place that we are not going to change right now. But the first step, like Pam mentioned, like SROs in schools is a conversation that has to continue. And there's a lot of community support for them, but there's also a lot of community backlash to their presence and the harm that they do to our kids. And I think we have to be so mindful of the mistreatment and just emotional toll that they may have on our kids.
And to Kristen's point, those girls can't unsee that. That 14-year-old child will always have that memory. Kristen mentioned that there's no evidence that a school resource officer will or can assist in an active shooter situation, though that's the rationale for SROs. But we do have really solid evidence to suggest that the presence of SROs results in increased petitions and increased arrests when they're present in schools. We saw with No Child Left Behind legislation that preparation for teachers was more content-based, and we removed classes like trauma, classroom discipline, difference, all kinds of things that were perceived as softer, but which would help teachers diffuse some of that situation and rely less on calling a uniformed police officer down the hall. The other thing I want to come back to is We talked about bias earlier. We talked about adultification of children of color, of girls of color. And so there's a term that's misogynoir, and it is the intersection of misogyny and girls of color, race and gender together. And when Black and brown girls and Indigenous girls, when girls of color are perceived as older than their chronological age, then the people who perceive them that way think that they need less protection and are less innocent. So to what Kristen was talking about, that's a culture shift that we're going to need to build.
I agree. I'm so glad you guys are bringing up just several different things to think about when it comes to this topic. And I wanted to kind of get your perspective. And some folks were asking about this in the registration. Thank you all. Thanks everybody for registering too. Whoever is on the call, or not on the call, on our YouTube channel, like watching and tuning in, we truly appreciate it. And we see you. We see all of the questions that you've asked. And one question was around, I believe this person was an educator, and they were just asking, what do I do? Like, how can I be somebody that can create change in my school space, knowing all the things that I'm knowing now, learning what I'm learning probably in this, on this Zoom call or on this YouTube? What can I do? What can I do? So what kind of perspective could you give one of our lovely viewers?
I'm going to let Kristen take it home for the educators in the room. And y'all are getting to know me, and you're sensing that I'm all about some empirical evidence. So I'm going to give you a list of 6 things. You ready? I'm going to read it. But these are the 6 things that we've identified in some research that can help address this problem. So number 1, improve gender and culturally responsive program. Again, we've been focused on the boys. It's time to focus on the girls and that intersectionality that we talked about. We need to recognize that. Number 2, we need to recognize the intersectionality for all youthful offenders in order to reduce those group disparity. And to do that, we got to do what Pam said, and that's disaggregate our data a whole bunch of different ways. Number 3, increase trauma-informed services. Number 4, abolish, I'm going to say this slowly, abolish prostitution-related offenses for minors. There is no way a 13-year-old is autonomous enough to prostitute herself. Okay, I'm going to keep going as not to get all myself worked up in a lather over here. Okay, number 5, increase diversion opportunities. That is a direct way to reduce the criminalization of Black and brown and Indigenous and other racialized groups. Number 6, reduce reliance on detention, especially for our status and our nonviolent offenders. I can't tell you how many conversations we've had with defense attorneys, with social workers, with judges who indicate that they think and believe that putting a young woman in detention is a safer alternative than sending her home. So that's going to, again, take that culture shift that we're talking about. All right, I'm going to pass the baton to Kristen or Pam, whoever's ready.
Okay, I'll jump in. And just really to add to those amazing 6 points, right? Earlier I said a norm that I love is permission to be inarticulate, and I lean into that. I'm just going to speak from the heart per usual. But I think, like, for my educator folks, number 1, you're not alone. I remember being the teacher who was like, something's not right. And how do I speak up for myself and for my kids, because they deserve better, and I promise you they do. And so number 1, just like trust yourself, right? If you feel like something's off, it probably is. And so number 1, I think administrators and district leaders ensuring that people are having training and not just one time, right? Yes, we can go through this experience and say like, oh, I'm so woke. I'm so awake now. I know what's going on. Like, that's not going to cut it, right? Continuing to learn and push yourself. And even if you don't have district support, there's so many ways to engage online, on Twitter, on like Eventbrite, looking up different resources to constantly be learning. There are so many amazing books and resources, documentaries, that you can access to learn more about how to advocate for yourself and for your kids. I think to Susan's point, really similarly, we have to use restorative practices. I'm a huge fan and believer of the power of restorative practices and the power of circle. As a teacher, they did wonders for my classroom in New Orleans, and they do wonders for my middle school here in Cary. And so researching what restorative practices look like, ensuring that you're trained, and like, how do we give our kids, all kids, and especially those who are marginalized and often feel like they have no voice, how can we give them tools to advocate for themselves, resolve conflict, build community, all of these tasks that the world expects them to do, but we don't fully teach or educate them in. So I say implement restorative practices at whatever level you can. And I would say, like, there have to be some checks and balances. There are technical solutions, right, that are band-aids to this issue, but there are really adaptive solutions that we have to get in the nitty-gritty of and change our mindset to change, like Susan said, these exclusionary practices. Going to detention is not any better than being out of school. What are logical consequences? Because yeah, kids are kids. They're going to do things that are not perfect. I realize that every single day at my school. But they have to learn what is a replacement behavior. And we have to listen. If you're screaming, I have to listen. What are you screaming about? So for the educators out there, number one, you are not alone. You're not alone. Trust yourself. And ask. Just advocate for yourself. Ask. Speak up. It's not going to be easy, but keep doing it.
And I'll just take it home. I'm a grassroots advocate through and through. So, I will continue to try to find ways to say, write in, write a letter, go to social media. But most importantly, and I think that's why this webinar, this Zoom conversation today between USA and Central Carolinas is so great, is because we always say in the YWCA family that we are stronger as one. We move together as one. So find your community, find your voice. Find those that unify with similar perspectives, and move together as one strong unified voice, and make your voice heard on this issue. And so if the shameless plug on the YWCA Action Center does not provide you ways to write your letters, plan a petition, things like that, do give us a way and reach out and let us know how we can help.
Thank y'all so much. I literally have been like jotting down notes. I have printed out stuff. Y'all can't, I don't know why I put this up like y'all can see it. You can't see it, but I have been taking a ton of notes about everything. I do want to shout out YWCA Central Carolinas youth program, because the youth programming that we do at our centers is actually culturally responsible curriculum. So that is what we built. And that shift happened, I think, recently. Kirsten, yes, Kirsten gave me a heart. So that means yes, it was a recent call, but it was a necessary call to make sure that our students felt seen, felt heard, in the things that they were doing in those educational spaces after school. So it's very important for us to do that. I'm so thankful that I work for an organization that moves the dial on stuff like that. And also, I love the fact that Kristen brought up, the kids are screaming. I used to work at a high school. I used to witness fights, arguments, all these different things, sometimes daily. But one thing I had to remember as somebody working in an educational space, and educators can probably take this on too, and it probably said this before, but it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. What's going on in your world at this moment that is like causing you to feel this way? Why are you feeling sad? Why are you feeling upset? And you'll notice so much tends to melt away, especially for our young girls of color. It melts away and they're able to have a conversation with you about what's going on. Or you pull out a sheet of paper. I've watched 18-year-old kids draw because they just didn't know how to say what they wanted to say. But they used that medium to make sure that they felt heard. And that takes me to another question that I have for you all. I'm a firm believer in youth empowerment and empowering youth to make the change they want to see, because we cannot do the work we do without actually, talking to them. So how can educators and those in leadership positions actually utilize youth voice in creating solutions for this issue?
I can jump in. When reading this question, something that popped into my mind is like a proverb that I love that I think maybe Chris Emden shared, Dr. Chris Emden shared while he was speaking. But if kids are not embraced by the village, they will burn it down to feel its warmth. And that is so true in our schools. I remember as a teacher, students will tear up my classroom, flip over every desk, because there is something in them that they need, right? Especially our girls of color, they need connection, they need love, they need affirmation. And if they're not being provided that, you are going to know one way or another. And so I think creating spaces where specifically girls feel safe and welcome, girls of color feel safe and welcome to share their opinions without fear of retribution or how will I, be punished. I'll never forget 3 years ago when my first year as an assistant principal, a 6th grade Black girl asked me, Ms. McCollum, do you think Black kids are treated different at this school? I said, well, yeah, I do. She said, yeah, and gave me all these examples. And if an 11-year-old can share that from her experience and has all these data points, right? Observation, these are things that doctoral candidates do, right? She's observed, she's doing a focus group at lunch, she's talking to her peers about it. All of this is happening. Imagine if she had a structure and a system to actually voice that, and not just like hoping and praying that the Black AP I know will hear me, right? Because what if I wasn't her assistant principal? Would she have told anybody? Would she have asked that question? And so they have things to say. They just need a platform to say it and know that they're going to be loved regardless of what they share. Know that they're going to be supported, and like we are still going to be here. And then after they share, okay, so what now? What you told me, I can't just say, okay, thank you for sharing. Yep, Black kids are treated differently. Go back to 5th period. That can't be their reality. What more to that is going on? And I've heard you, I see you. Now this is what we're going to do, right? How can you help me? How do you want Black kids to be treated here? What is the difference? What do you need? And so we have to really lead with love. We don't talk about love as much as we should in education. I love my teachers, I love my kids, my students. And they have to know we love them so they will really share and advocate for themselves.
I think the only thing I can add to that is kudos to you, Kristen, because you provided that student space, a safe space, to be able to voice that opinion, help them peel back those layers. And so we need more administrators and teachers like you in this classroom these days, because we need leaders of color, we need women of color in these spaces, advancing role models like you. So congratulations on a job well done with that conversation.
Ditto to what she said and what she said. The only thing that I would add is that power piece. So, empowering women, we have to, as leaders, as APs, we have to share that power with the children, with the clients, with the young people who are involved, so that they can be part of the solution, so that they're invested in the solution, so they're not flipping those desks over. To me, in my world, it's kind of a both and. So we've got fish to fix, and there's lots of love and hugs that we need to give once we're all, masked up and safe and all that. We got to go back to hugging one another. And the second piece is we've got to examine the systems. So when I heard Jamila and Kirsten, I got Kristen on one side, I got Kirsten down there, they talked about how do we change the program to respond to the needs of the youth. And so that programmatic level change, that systemic level change has to come as a result. Kristen said, now what? You know, we've got to do something based on what we learned from the children. And that means we got to fix the lakes and we got to fix the groundwater that we're all swimming in.
I love that. I love that you thought about, and you spoke about systems change and the importance of systems change. And I'm so grateful that folks in Congress, like Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, she actually introduced the Ending Pushout Act. And I know that is an act that YWCA supports, along with the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act. And so, Pam, can you speak a little bit more about our support of those two bills? Because it's really exciting. It gives you a little hope.
Definitely. Where to begin? Oh my goodness, this bill has taken a course and has been a bill that we have been working on at YWCA for, I don't know if I can say fortunately or unfortunately, because of the time it has taken to essentially continue to educate, but then eventually address this issue. But by way of background, the Ending Pushout Act, essentially acknowledges, the harmful ways in which Black and brown girls are criminalized and over-policed at school, and takes that time to not only educate, understand those findings and those disproportional effects on girls of color, but essentially calls to invest in safe and nurturing school environments for all students, but in this particular case, especially girls of color. So, this bold framework really works to not only address, collect more data, disaggregate and cross-tabulate that data, like we've said, most importantly, but transform that American criminalization system. So we are, to Susan's analogy earlier, beginning to plug that leaky pipeline as we see and break down that pathway from the school to prison pipeline, which we need to wholeheartedly continue to address. So creating additional spaces, safe spaces, nurturing environments that allows all students to essentially heal and thrive and essentially reach their highest potential going forward. Unfortunately, I will say that, like I had mentioned earlier, this does not have as many co-sponsors on the legislation as we would like. It has been seen as a highly partisan issue, despite the effects that this has on girls of color across the country. Red, blue, purple, East Coast, West Coast, no matter where you are seeing. So it's unfortunate of the politicization of this issue going forward. But we know that this is just the first step of many pieces of legislation that I think we need to see Congress not only take action on, pass, but then also once bills are passed, our work does not end there. We need to be able to hold administrators accountable, and now enforce these rules and these policies and ensure that they are enforcing them accurately too, right? And so, there is a long, long road that we have to go when it comes to not only passing legislation, but calling for that additional transparency, additional independent investigations and training, data collection going forward. So we applaud Congresswoman Pressley, Congresswoman Watson-Coleman, and Congresswoman Omar for their first introduction of this bill. We encourage you all to go on to YWCA's Action Center to take action and write your member of Congress on this particular issue and call on Congress to really say we are long overdue for this bill to be passed and put into law.
Thank you so much for just giving us some perspective on these bills and acts that are in place. So people know this is an issue. We cannot sit here and hide this anymore. It's no longer acceptable because children's lives are at stake. Their livelihoods are at stake. We don't know how these different types of oppressive acts are impacting who they are as people just by themselves, who they're going to aspire to be. There's so many things that we will never truly understand. But we understand now because we're having this conversation now how oppressive this is. So thank you all so much. We are like 3 minutes away from it kind of wrapping up. But before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you, number one, to all of you all on the call. We couldn't even get through all the questions because you guys have just been super, super awesome with your responses. I have taken so many notes. As you guys know, I've taken a ton of notes. And I'm ready to really just get into high gear on what we can do next. And one way we can get into what we're going to do next is we're actually going to have an open discussion about the book Push Out, as well as the documentary by Dr. Monique Morris. You guys are all welcome to attend. Everybody in YouTube world, please, please, please sign up and register online at YWCA CentralCarolinas.org under our events tab, because this conversation does not have to stop here. We want educators on that Zoom call. We want researchers. If you're just a mom or you're just a dad or you're a parent, we want you on that call. We want to make this conversation continue. So just be sure to lock in with us with that. But if we don't, I still want to keep talking. That's so terrible. But I want to wrap it up. And I just want to ask you guys just something short. What is your hope for girls of color in our educational system? And that's what we'll wrap it up right there.
Kristen, you want to go first? Okay. I mean, I could simply say, for the interest of time, that we see a world where girls of color have the opportunity to heal and really just thrive and reach their highest potential, and see a world where they are equal to their counterparts, regardless of color.
I want them to be able to go to their preschool, and I want their preschool teacher, unlike the Yale Child Study, I want their preschool teacher to look at them and see their beauty, to see their brilliance, to see their potential. I want them to be able to go to middle school, to Kristen's middle school. I want them to be able to see teachers that look like them, assistant principals that look like them. And I don't want them coming with a long list of ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. And then ultimately, and not if this happens, but when this happens, I want for researchers like me not to be able to predict suspension rates, expulsion rates, detention rates, or incarceration rates based on race or gender. Bat us home, Kristen.
Well, only thing to add, I honestly just want our girls to be free, right? I want our girls of color to be and feel free, their minds, body, spirit, soul, to be free in our education system and allow education to liberate them versus oppress them.
Y'all are just the bee's knees. I truly adore each and every one of you. And I'm leaning into what Kristen was saying. I'm being a little informal, but I do truly appreciate you all for really having this important conversation with us. And we are excited as a YWCA to continue the conversation. And we just want our girls of color, like Kristen said, to be free, to be who they want to be, aspire to be who they want to be, and speak and say whatever they please without feeling like they have to, kind of not say it like they want to say it, if that makes any sense. But either way, thank you all so much. Thank you, everybody in YouTube land. Come back and join us. Please, please, please have a great evening. Stay safe, continue researching, and stay curious. All right. Bye. Thank you.